Hello everyone, and welcome to this special event at the Hay Festival. My name is Misha Glenny, and I am the Rector of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, or IWM Vienna in English. It's an advanced research institute which is known for its specialist engagement with Eastern, Central and Southeastern Europe. But we've also been running a program for several years called Europe's Futures. And I'm very pleased that we are co-hosting this with the Hay Festival today. But let me first of all, before we go on, introduce our guests. I am very, very pleased to introduce you to Rafał Trzaskowski from Warsaw. He is the mayor of Warsaw. Hello. He's a former MEP. There you go. You wait till you hear him speak. He's a former MEP and minister in the Polish government. He's been educated all over the place, including in Paris and Oxford, and he has worked not only with the Polish government, but also in Brussels and now back in Warsaw. Among other qualities of his is that he is a simultaneous interpreter and a professed bookworm. Arguably, I would say, the best-read politician in Europe. I can also exclusively reveal here that his party colleague and Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, said yesterday that he, Tusk, would not be standing for the Polish presidency next year, but he hoped that Rafał Trzaskowski would. So you may well be looking at the next President of Poland, even though a week is a long time in politics, as we're finding out. Next to me is Emma Graham-Harrison, Senior International Affairs Correspondent of The Guardian. Now, Emma is here, and I'm especially grateful to her because Cathy Ashton unfortunately called me this morning and said she's come down with a terrible bout of flu and cannot make it to Hay. I've known Cathy for many years, and believe you me, if she says she can't make it, then she is genuinely ill. And so I'm, as I say, terribly grateful to Emma for jumping in at this last moment and joining us. She is with The Guardian and The Observer, of course. She's won multiple awards for her international reporting and investigative journalism, covering conflicts all over the place, including, of course, the current war in Ukraine, Gaza, Israel, America's invasion of Iraq, and many more. She was named Foreign Correspondent of the Year in the 2018 National Press Awards, and her first-class degree from Oxford was in Chinese studies. She spent a year as a student of Chinese literature in Beijing. And last, but by no means least, we have at the end Ivan Krastev, who is the thinking person's think tanker. He is a Bulgarian political scientist who has been analyzing European and global politics for the last 35 years. And I'm pleased to say he is a permanent fellow at the IWM in Vienna, the institute where I work. His advice is sought by so many politicians that a mutual friend of ours recently quipped that he has breakfast with Chancellor Scholz in Berlin, lunch with Macron in Paris, before just making it in time to Washington for dinner with the president. This is the second collaboration, as I said, that the IWM has undertaken with the Hay Festival in our series, Europe's Futures. And Europe's future has, to be perfectly honest, rarely looked as uncertain as it does today. However, there are some bright spots on the horizon. The chaos of British politics, which some might argue was triggered by Brexit, could now come to an end, as Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party looks favourite to register a convincing win over a Tory party in disarray. But who knows? But in Europe, there are elections coming up in early June as well, to the European Parliament, which is likely to see a significant shift to the far right. Ukraine still hangs hangs on as its war against the Russian invaders becomes ever more intense. The situation is extremely tough there. And of course, we have the Gaza-Israeli war, which has unsettled people around the globe, including having a major political impact here in Europe. This is before we even get to the planetary issues of the climate crisis and the green transition, potential threats from artificial intelligence, the US presidential elections, or Sino-US competition. So, where does Europe sit in all of that? Is it a passive bystander or a reluctant superpower no more? Well, before the British elections, less than a year ago, Poland's populist party, the PIS, was ousted by a liberal coalition, shifting the dial significantly in the balance of forces in Europe. So I'd like to turn first of all to Rafał Trzaskowski as one of the coalition's leading lights. Rafał, perhaps you can tell us, what is it like coming into government after many years of an incompetent, venal and corrupt administration?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm ecstatic to be here, first time in Wales. Bought a lot of books today. I guess my wife's going to divorce me, but that's a different story. Well, yes, I mean, the situation in Poland has changed significantly because after 8 years of populist government, we are able to win, which sends a pretty positive signal to Europe and to the world, I would submit to you. Because, of course, it is very difficult to win with the populists when they control the media, when they have lots of money, when they actually decided to take over the state, used, for example, the financing for the state-owned enterprises to fund their endeavors. Yet we won because people just had enough. People had enough, and most importantly, we were able to mobilize the young, and we were able to mobilize women, and actually they won the elections for us. There were multiple different reasons for that. One of them was the isolation on the European scene, and of course also a medieval anti-abortion law which was introduced by the populists. And of course the times are difficult because I mean we are confronting multiple crises whenever we look. I mean I'm a mayor of the capital city, and I thought that I could just concentrate on managing Warsaw. And yet in the past few years we had a pandemic, and the populist government was shifting most of the responsibility our way. We run 11 hospitals. Then of course the war, and we had to manage the refugee crisis. And of course the implications of the war in Ukraine are felt everywhere, but they're felt quite palpably, most palpably I think in Warsaw and in Poland, because we are just on the other side of the border. So I think that there are quite a lot of messages for us all. I mean, one is that populism is on the rise, and this is not just a problem of Eastern Europe. I remember when I was explaining it to my American friends 8 years ago, they were like looking at me, those barbarians from the East, what do they know? But after President Trump was elected, after the attack on the Capitol, they started understanding that this is a problem of democracy as such, that now in times of polarization, in times of social media where we're closed in our bubbles and those algorithms that just reinforce a conflict, we need to talk to the people, grassroots, as much communication as possible, and we have to translate those incredibly difficult, complex problems into something much more palatable to the people, much more understandable to the people. Rule of law, who understands that? But when individual freedoms are taken away from us, and when some of the governments are not just populist, but they take over the states and introduce complete chaos, lack of accountability, and lack of credibility, then people voice their concerns, and then they vote for change.
So just a quick follow-up on that, because it's perhaps not quite so familiar with this audience, that Poland in the past 10 to 15 years or so has become an increasingly powerful member of the European Union. There was a meeting today and yesterday between the governments of Poland, Germany and France, And increasingly, Germany and France have to listen to what the government in Warsaw is saying, because its economy is so important, its political influence is growing, and also as a member of the defense community in Europe, Poland is gaining traction. Is Poland aware that it's becoming a critical country in the European game?
Well, we have been developing very, very fast, and we are projected to overtake Britain in 35, partly because Britain left the EU. This is incredible. We spend 4% of GDP, of our GDP for defense, because, you know, in current situation, that's obvious. And we are a very competitive member of the European Union. And plus, there is this huge vacuum of leadership in Europe. So Donald Tusk, who used to be Prime Minister for 8 years and then President of the European Council, provides that leadership. And now, of course, with France and with Germany, we are in a sense destined to lead. And we miss Britain. We miss Britain because we really think alike on many different issues: defense, security, but also when it comes to our view of the internal market and trade. That's why I hope that even though Brexit has been decided, that there is a possibility of Britain being much closer with us and collaborating closely with us on some of those very, very important issues, even if it stays outside of the European Union.
Well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that specifically later on, but something closer to home now in Poland, and I want to turn to Emma here, is of course the conflict in Ukraine. Emma, last year saw the failure of the much vaunted offensive of the Ukrainian military, and there is a growing sense of concern, even fear and desperation in Ukraine that it does not have the resources or is not getting the resources that it needs to defend itself against the Russian military. What's your assessment of where we are with the Russia-Ukrainian war at the moment?
So yeah, it's a long way from sort of, 6 months into the war when you'd had this extraordinary Ukrainian military success in pushing Russian troops back from Kyiv, taking swathes of territory back around Kharkiv in the east. Russia at the time started emptying its prisons, famously under the Wagner Group, sending people to the front line essentially as cannon fodder. And there was a lot of, at that time, people were sort of almost deriding it, this is sort of Russia's old trick, it just wants to throw people, but we've got the motivation, or Ukraine has the motivation, it has the skills, it has a high-tech military, it's got Western technology behind it. And what's ended up happening is that Russian absolute willingness to sacrifice the lives of tens of thousands of people without them, at least the people who came from prisons had a choice, but many people conscripted without choice, has proved that an old Russian military tactic can still have some success. The war is very far from divided, but as you say, it's now 2 years into a war. If you talk to people in Ukraine, they're having to adjust to a new reality. War, it takes away your future because everything's on hold. For many people, it's taken away their past, literally or figuratively. Their homes have been destroyed. They can no longer go back to the places they're from. If they're men, they're either fighting or living under the shadow of potentially being conscripted. Everything is in the shadow of the war. There's the physical inconveniences, even a small thing like the fact you can't fly. Ukraine is a huge country. For I imagine many people haven't been there. Going across it by train can take literally days. Just getting in and out of the country for people who can still move. And then the loss, people are starting to talk about a lost generation because so many Ukrainians have died. And there's the cruel reality of size. The Ukrainian population is about a quarter the size of the Russian population, I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong off the top of my head. But, and is not a country where you can do this. It's a democracy, not an autocracy, and so you can't push people to their deaths on the front line in the same way that Russia can. And what that's led to internally is this sense of fear about where things are going. And then you have the external factors, which many in Ukraine feel, with some justification, are even more critical, which is that the West is sort of so stop and start about how much it wants to support Ukraine. You know, even at the beginning of the war, you know, first Ukraine only was given anti-tank missiles, then it fought off Russians with those, then we sort of escalated the weaponry we were willing to give them, but we sort of the democratic West provides weaponry sort of in fits and starts that most of it has come from America, which is very ambivalent, and hanging over it. So you've seen a shortage of weapons being provided, which has led to the current situation. Russia's pushing on the front lines, stretching Ukraine's tired forces, and making some territorial gains. And, you know, Ukrainians say, I think with some justification, if you'd given us the stuff you gave us later at the beginning, we could have potentially capitalized on those early advances. And that's even more the case now, this stop-start approach. You know, America keeping them waiting for a long time for weapons which were finally voted through, but they're not going to arrive for another couple of weeks, in which Russia is making further gains. And then hanging over the whole conflict is the really terrifying shadow of the US election and what happens if Trump comes to power. You know, he's been pretty clear about what he thinks about supporting Ukraine. It seems very unlikely that would shift. So then Ukraine would have to fall back on a Europe, which is still divided about how much it's willing to support Ukraine. You have countries like Poland, which have made sacrifices in every possible way, you know, economically and supporting refugees, things like that. But you have other countries that are ambivalent, and we just don't have at present the military capacity to manufacture what Ukraine needs for its defense. I mean, I spent a lot of my career charting the horrors inflicted by sort of the Western military-industrial complex in places like Afghanistan. But, you know, then you look at Ukraine and you can see the lack of the capacity to manufacture weapons can also, you know, lead to abuses and a situation where you have democracy very vulnerable.
Before I go to Ivan to broaden the discussion out a little, I just want to go to Rafał on this question of Ukraine, because of course Poland has been Ukraine's biggest supporter. It's been a difficult relationship, partly because of the economic impact that Ukrainians' access to the EU market has had, and of course Poland has been so generous in hosting refugees. But how does Poland look at it? The fear that Ukraine might lose this war and the implications for Polish security amongst other countries. Do you have the same bleak outlook that Emma seems to have in terms of whether Ukraine can withstand another year, 18 months, 2 years of the Russian assault?
Well, I mean, the most important thing that this is not just a Polish problem, and it has to be repeated and repeated again and again and again. All the crazy dictators are looking at us. Are we serious? Are we strong as a Western alliance, as North Atlantic alliance? We, the Europeans, and Britain, of course, included. I mean, if we are going to fail, then we are not going to be credible as partners to anyone. And I think that Putin has miscalculated on so many different fronts. He thought that Ukraine will crumble. But most importantly, he thought that we are not going to get serious. And we got serious, all of us, Britain included. So now either we persevere and we prove that we are a force to be reckoned with, or we are going to lose on every imaginable front. And Putin is just having a bit of respect when he sees power, when he sees commitment. So that's why it's so incredibly important that we keep on helping Ukraine, because this is not a slogan, guys. These guys are really fighting for our freedom and for our values. And when we talk about values all the time, these guys are actually bleeding and dying for those values that we talk about. And of course, from the Polish perspective, this is incredibly important. We are threatened every other day by Putin, but everyone is threatened, because if we're serious about NATO, I mean, if he's threatening Poland or the Baltic states, Britain is being threatened, United States is being threatened at the same time. And of course, you know, we have shown this incredible solidarity. I mean, I don't know whether you remember, like in 2015, we were in complete panic when we had those immigration waves coming through the Mediterranean. Europe was in panic. We couldn't cope with it. It also had its influence on Brexit. We had, at a peak, we had 200,000 refugees coming to Europe. We had 300,000 refugees coming to Warsaw in 3 weeks and staying in Warsaw because there were 2 million which passed through my city. And we were able to welcome them and to help them out. But yes, there are tensions because if we, on the one hand, we tell our farmers, you need to abide by the stringent rules of the European Union when it comes to the quality of food. And then on the other hand, we open our borders for Ukrainian grain without any controls. Of course, that hypocrisy provokes quite a reaction from our farmers. But this is totally secondary, and we know how to deal with that with the European Commission and so on and so forth, to the questions of security, which are paramount. And that's why we have to keep on supporting Ukraine. And the last thing is that the pandemic and also the war proved how vulnerable we are, all of us, that we are so much dependent on other partners when it comes to industrial base, when it comes to like raw materials, even our medicine, you know, we are so much dependent on others. That's why we have to strengthen the European Union and strengthen our relations with Britain and with all of our partners if we are to be able to actually confront all the challenges that are before us.
Thank you, Rafał. Ivan, as I said, I want to broaden things out a little. As you know, we've got the European parliamentary elections coming up in the second week in June. So we're expecting a pretty robust performance by the far right in many European countries. Can you talk to us a little about the longer trends, issues around the demographic crisis in Europe, the issue of migration, the aging society, changes in work and so on? What is happening in Europe? Are we seeing something fundamentally different?
Thank you very much. I'll start with the fact that I'm East European of a particular generation. I was 25 years old in 1989. And there is one thing that my generation has learned. Things can change very fast. In 1989, they changed into the directions that we liked. But we know that they also can change very fast in the directions that we don't like. So the speed of change is something that from time to time we're totally underestimating. And the first thing is, you're all reading newspapers, not only books, and you know that there is a rise of far right in Europe. Most probably, far right parties are going to be the biggest party in 9 of the European Union member states. And believe me, we're not talking Bulgaria. We are talking France, Italy, Belgium, Austria, probably even Poland, Hungary. So imagine the psychological effect of all this. By the way, all these parties are not the same. Far right is quite different in different places, but this is going to be psychological, very strong impact. Secondly, even when the vote is going to take place, you are not going to know what has really happened. For a very simple reason. This time, European elections are going to be in 2 rounds. And on the second round, Americans are going to vote. And depending how the American presidential elections goes, different parties and different countries are going to adopt different positions. Different positions towards Brussels, different positions towards the war in Ukraine, very different positions. So we're going to be in a period in which the level of volatility is very, very, very high. Great Czech writer, Milan Kundera, has a great definition of what is vertigo. He said, vertigo is not the fear of falling. Vertigo is the desire to fall against which we struggle. And in a certain way, Europe is going to be in a vertigo moment. And of course comes the problem of migration. People, when they talk about migration from time to time, don't understand that it's slightly different and bigger. What we have in Europe is demographic anxiety. Our populations are shrinking, and our populations are aging. And suddenly, we start to realize it. Because remember, when COVID came, suddenly all of us learned how old we are. Not how we feel. By the way, we also suddenly learned the structure of our societies. For example, in my country, Bulgaria, we learned that the average age of the Bulgarian doctors is 54 years. And suddenly you start to imagine what is happening. So migration is not simply the fear of people coming. Migration is also the fear of those who have left the country. 15% of the Bulgarian population has left since 1989. This is true for countries like Romania. But listen, 1 million Italians has left Italy after basically the financial crisis. And I'm saying this because you have migration, but you have also out-migration. And interestingly enough, talking about the far right, paradoxically, believe me, in the way the ex-communists in Eastern Europe legitimize the market, far right, if they're going to come to power, are going to legitimize migration. Because one of the things that you're seeing, for example, in places like Italy, is that parties that have been very much elected on the anti-migration vote, during their basically government, the number of migrants increased.
We saw exactly the same in the United Kingdom.
But do you know what? Even more, Mrs. Meloni went openly and said, we need at least 500,000. So what is going to happen is certain type of European hypocrisy that was very typical in 2015 is going to change. Because then the story was, we don't want economic migrants, we are open only to refugees, so we are pushing every economic migrant to pretend that they're a refugee. Now we are saying, in fact, we want economic migrants, we don't want refugees. And I'm saying this because all this is happening in Europe. This goes big. And as a result of it, European politics is really going to change in a big way and very fast. And this is changing because everything around us is changing. By the way, this demographic fear, don't forget, it's not only Europe. Nobody is going to understand Russia's war in Ukraine if he does not know that President Putin was totally obsessed with Russia's demographic decline, that there are not enough Russians in the world. And because there were not enough Russians in the world, Ukrainians should be Russians. And the Russians should be Russians. And I'm saying this because there is one thing about which we don't know how to talk, and it is demography. Demography is not just statistical results. Demography is demographic imagination. Suddenly, people start to live with projections. How many of them, how many of us, what is going to happen? And I do believe that when we're talking about the change of European politics, this is one of the things that we're going to see.
Emma, and another conflict that you've been covering, of course, is Israel and Gaza. Now, this has been an incredibly emotive experience, not merely for people in the Middle East. It's had a big impact on politics in Europe. Do you think Europe has developed a credible strategy for policy towards the Middle East, or are we just bystanders outside of the game compared to, say, the United States or Qatar or Iran or even Russia?
I mean, I think when it comes to this particular conflict, in a way, everybody is a bystander to the United States in some respects, in terms of influence over Israel. But, you know, you can see the response of Israel to the recognition of a Palestinian state by 3 European countries just this week, you know, absolutely furious. It shows that Europe does still matter a great deal, does still have a lot of influence. And what's certainly true is that you know, politically, the conflict and what the response it should be is controversial and divisive everywhere, from America to here. But it is interesting, and I think because it's the scale of it means that there's division on how to respond everywhere. But it does feel like Europe is feeling its way, perhaps, towards a new position. It's interesting that recently the EU agreed sanctions, which you know, because you need the joint agreement on that, was unexpected. So, you know, I think Europe does have the potential to be an important player in this war, as much as anyone who isn't the US is. But I think you should also think about the war almost in reverse, which is how it's impacting the EU and Europe more generally, because, you know, in many ways, Gaza's tragedy is also a tragedy for Ukraine, because there's always a war of weapons and then a war of words. And part of what Ukraine was trying to do, or has been trying to do, is to present a case that it is fighting an anti-imperialist war, which Russia rejects, and people who buy into the Russian narrative reject. And because of sort of the legacies of Cold War era policies, many of the people who've supported Russia in its war in Ukraine have been countries from the global south. And the effort to persuade those countries to change their perspective on that war became a lot harder when you had, for instance, the US condemning the mass bombing of Mariupol, but not only not condemning, but continuing to send bombs to Israel when it was also carrying out bombing of civilian infrastructure on a large scale in Gaza. And so you had countries that perhaps were considering in the global south supporting or being more receptive to the Ukrainian and European perspective on that war, who it sort of reinforced those old camps really in a way, and I think has made it much harder for Ukraine and Europe to put their position to the rest of the world. And I think obviously that there's the urgency in both wars of the tragedy that's unfolding, but I think that political implication, maybe because people are looking at other things, hasn't been so noticed, but actually it's quite important.
So, Rafał, we have security issues which are very immediate. We have Ukraine, we have the Middle East. We have been coming out of a very difficult period economically, the pandemic, and then, of course, to a certain degree, recessions and certainly inflationary pressures, which all local politicians are having to manage. But does that mean that the sort of really big planetary issues like the climate crisis, the green transition, which is so important to Europe, are we neglecting that because of the fact that we're trying, if not always succeeding, to put out fires left, right, and center? What's happened to our strategy on the green transition and climate change?
Well, I think we started off by talking about the populists. And by the way, what we are looking at in Israel is exactly the same. We see populists in government who just make the reality worse and worse and worse. And I've just seen on BBC today, two different groups of Israelis actually fighting. One trying to block the humanitarian aid, and the police staying idle, and another trying to allow those trucks or facilitate the transportation of food. And like the greatest problem is that today there is not enough courage in politics. Why? Because all of our opinions get reinforced, because we live in this world of social media. There's almost zero bipartisanship on issues that really matter. And everything you do can be used against you. And on top of that, everyone is just looking at what's happening at a given moment. And politicians' careers can be ended just because some guys get excited on Twitter. So that's why so much depends on you guys. That we should not pay attention to what's happening today and now, but we should think about greater ramifications. That we should try to isolate ourselves from just the opinions of the people with whom we are in the same bubble, and try to pierce the bubble and try to prove that conflict is not the only thing that should propel us in politics. Because if not, the natural instinct of all the politicians will be to avoid the difficult issues. And that's why I think that there's some people, some politicians try to avoid difficult issues such as Gaza and Israel, such as Ukraine now, especially during the election time. And now coming back to the green transition. I mean, everyone who is educated knows that if we do not do something now, that it will be too late. And unfortunately, the populists are trying to say that basically it's debatable, which is incredible. It's as if, as if we could elect politicians who would say that the earth is flat. And it all depends on us, because, I mean, if we are going to send a signal that guys who are saying that the earth is flat will never be elected, then those guys are going to say what they say. And now, of course, all of those problems are incredibly important and are dependent on the political landscape that we now observe. Because if Trump wins, I mean, the situation will get even worse. Now, what is happening now is, because many people are saying, you know, when the Europeans are very ambitious, along with Britain, very ambitious on climate change, then why do we do it? The Chinese and the others are not going to follow. They are going to follow, because we are incredibly forceful as an economic power. And if others want to trade with us, then they have to abide by the rules. So if we are tough on fighting climate change, I mean, if someone is not going to follow, then they will have very difficult economic relations with Europe. And no one can afford it. And of course, Britain also cannot afford it, and that's why you should be with us at least in the customs union. But that's a different issue. Now, when it comes to climate change, now, of course, everyone is focusing on the most important and immediate challenges. So if you talk about security, then you tend to forget about climate change. But if we want to stand up to the threats that are so different, pandemics, dictators, and so on and so forth, we have to become, first of all, independent. We have to have our own industrial base, we have to reinforce our own standards, and we have to create new jobs. And we have to be as modern, as innovative as possible. And that's what the green transition is actually allowing us to do. Not only fight the climate change, which is absolutely crucial, because if we do not do it, the planet will burn. Not only fight for clean air, not only for our cities to be more livable, greener, nicer, more fun, but also to create an absolute economic power. And that's why we need to do it together. But of course, I mean, the thing that people just hate is hypocrisy and not talking enough to the people. And that's, and I'm coming back to deliver a punchline, that's why we need courage. And it's not enough for some of the European politicians just to do it, because we need to explain it to the people. That's why we have problems with farmers today. And not too many politicians want to do that, because it's controversial. And if it's controversial, then normally you just don't talk about it. And that's why I think that if we want to be relevant, especially for the young generation, we need to be courageous, we need to talk about the issues, we need to take decisions, because if not, we are going to become completely irrelevant to the young generation. And here, I mean, if someone is to really help us out when it comes to fighting the populists, it's the young. And if the young become disinterested, then the populist threat is even greater. And Poland has just proven that. In the last elections, we had 75% of the turnout, 85% in Warsaw. That was incredible, unheard of in a country which has a relatively young democracy after communism. And it was that we were able to actually galvanize the young people, that we were able to talk about the challenges, show them that we need to be and we want to be courageous, that actually they went and they changed the government, and they actually helped us to say goodbye to populism. That's what we need to do everywhere. And when I observe the British campaign, the British electoral campaign, I have to talk about it just one or two sentences. Because, I mean, seriously, I mean, for us in Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, British democracy, American democracy, we were dreaming about it when I was 17 and living on the other side of the Iron Curtain. When I see the level of the debate in the US and in Britain, the lack of bipartisanship on some of the most important issues, and lack of courage, and lack of leadership, and regardless of the party, whether you like the Tories or not, I mean, just a disarray. I mean, in one of the leading parties in Britain. And it has an effect on the security of us all. Because, as I've said, we need Britain. We cannot do it without you guys. When it comes to stability, when it comes to credibility, also when it comes to trade. And if we're in it together, then we are going to really be strong. And then we are really going to have an influence over what's happening in the world. If not, I mean, the rising powers and the Russians and others are going to be the ones calling the shots. We really don't want that.
Ivan.
You can vote after the talk.
Ivan, both Rafał and Emma have referred to the US presidential election in November. Now, you look at this from the perspective of what should Europe be thinking? Let's assume Trump wins. What should Europe be preparing for in that case?
First, these elections on which we are not voting. Secondly, we know that an old man is going to be elected. No, but what I'm saying is, and this is critically important, because what Europe is going to think is one thing. What Europe can do is a different thing. Because on one level, and I very much agree with Rafał, is that Europe is looking for its autonomous place, and it is looking for this because we are seeing not simply that, for example, the United States is changing, that Russia is starting the war, but what is happening in the international politics is really dramatic. You have all these new great middle powers which are hyperactive. In a certain way, the international politics moved from the Catholic marriage to the Tinder period. So they're dating each other, basically, they're doing this and that. Look at Turkey. For example, President Erdogan is basically bride in every wedding, and he's a baby in every basic christening, because all these parties are looking for recognition. They're interested to get their status in international politics, and it's very much a status game. And for the European Union, in my view, the real risk is we have been the winners of the previous game, even more than the United States. European Union was very well positioned for the world in which economic power and soft power were the most important, where basically you have a quite open trade system, and suddenly we're in a totally different world. Listen, the 3-4 most important assumptions on which European security was based have been challenged dramatically. Economic interdependence. Chancellor Merkel believed, by the way, she was not irrational, that we are going to buy so much gas of Russia that they're never going to come to their mind to start a war. It turned to be not correct. We believed after 2003 and American basically war in Iraq that military power doesn't matter. As a result of it, when the war started, Ukraine has ammunition for 6 weeks, but one of the big European powers has ammunition for 6 days. I'm not going to name the country. So suddenly, thirdly, you understand that the biggest success of the European project, the pacification of European mind, is suddenly becoming vulnerability. 15 years ago, I'm sure that this famous historian was invited here to the Hay Festival because it was a great book under the title, Where Has All Soldiers Gone? Telling, look at Europe, we have been fighting all these years, and now there is peace. But now the question is where all these soldiers are going to come from. Because we're talking about budgets. Listen, budgets don't fight wars. People fight wars. And Europeans, for us, this is not part of the social contract. And I'm saying this because suddenly we're in a very hostile world. And of course, President Trump is one of the faces of this hostile world. But suddenly we realize that he's not on his own. Mr. Modi and many others basically share the idea that it's not about cooperation. And by the way, Europe was also insisting that we are a great regulator power, particularly when it comes to technology, but we do not have a single big technology companies. They're either American or Chinese. If America and China decide to create a big technological wall, and if they're going to be a new wall, it's going to be a technological wall, whom exactly we're going to regulate? Chinese or the Americans? And I'm saying this because for the generations that Rafał was talking, this is going to be, in my view, the real question. The real question is, it's so difficult to be the victim of your success. Because when you are a victim of your failure, in a certain way, you know that it failed, you're trying and we're doing this and that. But when the things that you did basically worked, this is what you wanted, and suddenly your victory is becoming the things that threatens you, it's so difficult. And this is why I do believe from time to time also we should be slightly more tolerant to the people. Listen, people are confused, but they have a good reasons to be confused. Simply the world that was promised to them has disappeared overnight, and they don't know what to do with in the new one.
Emma, before I throw it open for questions, have to address the possibility of a Labour Party victory under Sir Keir Starmer. and the elections in July. Starmer, Brexit, the European Union. What is the Labour Party's strategy likely to look like in the event, perchance, that they win?
I mean, there is a reason I chose to be a foreign correspondent. But, you know, I think on the one hand, they've been clear that they would like to sort of take up the invitations that are coming to rebuild ties with Europe in the ways they can. But I think they've also been pretty clear that as we've been sort of spent nearly a decade now in this domestic nightmare of trying to reconcile the sort of Brexit that was promised and that didn't exist with reality, really, and everything that entailed, that they don't really want to reopen that whole debate. But I think what's going to be the problem for them is that they are going to have to grapple with the reality that we have cut ourselves off from our main trading partner through Brexit. The other big, obvious sort of trading partner, the US, has no real interest in us in creating a trade deal. I mean, we caused a problem for them. We were sort of their conduit, their English-speaking, semi-detached conduit to the EU, really, and then we made ourselves useless by cutting ourselves off. I think that the thing that would be economically most beneficial would be rejoining the single market, but that comes with free movement, which for the reasons that you know has already been addressed so well, I think that Labour is not willing to accept. And I think even a customs union would involve so much in terms of negotiation and bandwidth. There's so much domestically that they want to deal with. Don't know if they'll have the bandwidth to do that. The question is, at what point is the lack of desire or bandwidth to negotiate with the EU going to come up against the hard reality that not being at least a member of the customs union, ideally a single market, leaves you without the prospect for economic development and the cash you need to deal with all your other problems at home. And it's sort of a bit of a, you know, rock on a hard place.
That's right. So Britain squeezed between American economic power, European economic power, and without the financial firepower required to generate a coherent industrial strategy. Which brings us to one final question, which I want Rafał to try and answer, and that is the European relationship with China. Because the relationship between the United States and China is now more hostile than the European relationship with China. But Europe is being constantly asked, badgered by both the Chinese and the Americans to take a side. Is Europe going to take a side on this, or will it be able to develop an independent policy of both of those two major powers?
Before I answer your question, I have to. I was a Minister of European Affairs of Poland, and I was also involved in the first stages of the Brexit negotiations. And, you know, I understand, you know, that there was a referendum and so on, and the British government was doing it, but I don't understand one thing. I mean, for how long can you dodge the question? For how long can you be unprepared to actually answer, you know, what is your strategy? I mean, this is just incredible. I'm just looking at Britain, one of the most serious countries in the world, taking one of the most serious decisions. And of course, the British people have spoken years and years ago, and there is no strategy. This is incredible. And the guys are actually allowed to dodge the questions on both sides of the aisle. Incredible. But really harmful to us all, because as I've said, we need Britain. And I think that now answering your question, I mean, first of all, we need to learn the lesson from Russia. I mean, this is really very, very important. So, you know, Ivan was absolutely right talking about Angela Merkel. We were telling our German friends, guys, you're dealing with a crook and a murderer. And he's just business as usual, and treating Russia as a credible partner and so on and so forth is going to lead us into a very difficult situation. We were telling our European friends we need to be independent when it comes to energy. The Brits were understanding it, the others were very reluctant. And I've heard on so many occasions when we're working on the energy security, on the energy union, to make the European Union, with Britain inside, independent, and people were saying, oh, you're completely obsessed with Russia. You do not understand it, and so on so many occasions. So, I mean, one thing is that we need to learn the lessons. And now, I think that our response to China, whatever happens, is that if we are going to be strong and credible, if we are going to be very much independent when it comes to our industrial base, when it comes to our investment in innovation, when it comes to our preparedness for every kind of scenario, when it comes to also our openness to new ideas and new people and so on and so forth, then the Chinese will simply be forced to reckon with us, okay? And this is the only solution. I mean, because, and that's why I submit to you that the war in Ukraine is so important, and our behavior on the international scene is so important. The European Unions and also the British, and that's why we need to be together on it. Why? Because that's the test of our credibility. I mean, if after all the things that we've done in the past few years, this waking up that we need to be independent, that we need to have access to raw materials, I mean, the Chinese bought half of the world. I mean, if you look at the map of Africa, of Asia and so on, like 20 years ago, most of the investments there were European. Now, 90% is in red. It's Chinese. They are buying ports, harbors, businesses all around the world, Europe included. So either we're going to be strong, independent, and we're going to show that on matters like security, we're able to collaborate with our partners, Britain included, close links with the with the Americans, and so on and so forth. And of course, you know, that hinges upon the effect of the elections in the United States. Or the Chinese will draw their lessons. So that's why it is so immensely important that we are the ones who set standards, that we are the ones who sign new trade deals with other partners. Look at what happened. This is the last thing I want to say. Look at what happened in just the past few years. I remember when I was talking to my British colleagues, British entrepreneurs, when the decisions about Brexit were being taken, and they were telling me, Commonwealth, we have those special relations, la 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 la. We've just signed new deals with Canada, with Singapore, with Mexico, with Australia, with New Zealand, as the European Union. I mean, either we create this club in which we set standards for everyone, and then Latin Americans, Africa, Asia, because they want to trade with us, they're going to comply. Also, when it comes to our fight with climate change, they're going to look at us and they will see, okay, this is not just an economic power and geopolitical dwarf as it used to be 20 years ago, or we're going to fail on all fronts. That's why it is so important.
A very sobering end to this bit of the conversation. We don't have much time, but we have some time for questions. So if I can ask our paddles to be raised. Are the paddles around? Yep. Where are they? I'm not seeing them. Oh, is that one over there? Sorry about this. Also, it's not very. The light's not very good. So
I see some hands raised.
yes, can someone go for a microphone to one of the hands? Say over there. Are there any microphones indeed in the hall?
Because people have to shout.
We can deal with shouting. Yes. You've got a microphone there.
I'll sit down. Oh, maybe not. When the Chinese exercise their influence as a great power, as all great powers have done, we suddenly get this sort of semi-strange attitude that this is unnatural, this shouldn't be done, and we get things like needless provocations, and I consider the American, I think she was a speaker, who visited Taiwan and started changing attitudes towards that and completely provoked the Chinese. The Taiwanese apparently were happy with the relationship they had. And I just wonder, is this confrontational attitude based in some sort of racist thing? I mean, the gentleman from Poland, whom I'm afraid I wasn't. Yes, the Chinese have expanded, but they've done this perfectly legally, and they've done it with the consent of the people involved. That happens with great power.
Great. Ivan, the Chinese, they had a terrible time in the 19th and 20th centuries with the West. Hasn't their time come?
Listen, we talk about the rise of China. Chinese talk about the return of China. They believe that the 3 centuries of European dominance was an exceptional period. It's a big country, by the way, with its own problems, both economic, political, and others. I very much agree with you that we are going to be, in my view, wrong, try to defend the status quo that has disappeared. We are not going to be where we have been in the early 1990s. By the way, Europe is going to be 6% of the world population. You're going to have a much lower share of the global GDP. And part of the story was, paradoxically, that 1990s have been successful. They were successful for others. China managed to reduce the poverty in the extent for the last 40 years that no other country in the world has done. Does it mean that China is going to be as peaceful as they pretend? In political science, we have kind of a rule. Capacities define intentions. The moment you feel powerful, you start to do things which yesterday we didn't want to do. And by the way, this is on the other side. Being weak is not good. And by the way, losing power is not fun. And from this point of view, the West is in a difficult position because we are in a position of managing losing relative power. We have been very, very powerful. And for many reasons, we should try to adjust to this new world. And this new world is not particularly welcoming, and they're starting to basically ask, and for the European Union, it's very interesting because in this world, you have the United States, you have the European Union. Listen, it's much easier to hate the European Union than the Americans. It's much lower cost. And from this point of view, suddenly, we believe that everybody likes us. After 1989, we see ourselves at the laboratory of the world to come. And suddenly we're seeing all these rising powers and their leaders extremely confrontational, by the way, accusing from time to time European Union for things that should not be accused. And this is a new moment, and I do believe that we're making this transition, trying to see, yes, by the way, the Chinese now are really totally subsidizing the economy and coming here. What we're going to do? If we're going to do nothing, we're not going to have economy. Basically, European industry is going to be a history in 10 years because there are going to be so much cheap imports coming from China that most of our productions are not going to be there. On the other side, and I very much agree with you, we're talking a lot about decoupling. There is one thing that you do not do when you want to decouple. Do not talk about decoupling.
I'm just going to say...
Rafał.
No, I'm just going to say 3 sentences because I thought that in my response about China, I was everything but patronizing towards China. I mean, first of all, Poland, by the way, was the first, communist Poland was the first country to recognize the People's Republic. I think I lived 18 years of my life under communism, so I can be critical, if you permit, of the system. Because, I mean, if we talk about, powers to be and so on and so forth, I would differentiate between democratic powers and powers which are not democratic. But I didn't say a word, almost a word, about China itself. I just said that we need to be a force to be reckoned with. We need to be independent. That's my response when it comes to our relations with China. And we need to be relevant and consistent.
Thank you. Rafał, I see paddle 1 and paddle 2, and I suggest we take both questions one after the other because of the time constraint.
Thank you. How do you currently see the state of European integrity? And there was talk in the past of a two-pole or two-speed European Union. Do you think that's still happening? I'm also asking in the context of China, for example, Xi Jinping recently visited Hungary and Bulgaria, announced a lot of joint infrastructure projects.
It was Serbia.
Sorry, Serbia. And before visiting France, a lot of joint infrastructure projects and growing influence, as well as there's still a strong influence of Russia. I know Poland has turned the page. How do you see the current state of affairs within Europe?
And the second question?
Right, rather a different matter. It's get back to the war in Ukraine. I've rather understood that wars are won by economic power in the end. And the economic power of Western Europe, as measured against Russia, is vastly greater. And yet, when it comes to the application, Russia seems to be able to produce far more resources to the front than Western Europe can. Do you think there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we have assessed the economic power of Russia and communist countries?
Anyone want to take on the first question, Rafał?
Well, I think that, you know, those ideas, and actually I was specializing myself with flexible integration. I mean, possibility of having, you know, two different circles of more integrated countries in the European Union and less integrated. This is like, that would be a tragedy for the European Union. And how would we divide the Europeans? Like the old Union and the new Union, the countries which are in the Eurozone and those which are outside of the Eurozone? That would be a tragedy. I mean, we need to be integrated exactly at the same pace. And the beautiful idea of the European Union was that it was always constructed bottom up. That's why all the ideas, you know, to federalize it, to do a constitution and so on, failed, because it has to be done bottom up with the people, but exactly at the same pace. Otherwise, we are going to become irrelevant even at a quicker pace. Now, the real problem is that some populists are contesting it, and Hungary is, of course, a wonderful case in point. And they're contesting it on many different fronts when it comes to relations with Russia, when it comes to relations with China. That's why the populist threat is so incredibly dangerous, because those guys can actually destroy the European Union, destroy our credibility. Look at what's happening now with the new government in the Netherlands. I mean, Meloni, even though she comes from the populist government, she tried to move a party into the center. Okay, how successful is that? That's a different story. But now we will see in the Netherlands. I mean, the new coalition, I mean, their program is to basically stop and stifle the European Union and basically make all the reforms impossible. And that's why the populist threat can actually undermine our security and undermine our future. That's why that's so important, because then some countries can start undermining our unity on questions such as security, on the most fundamental questions.
Emma, Ukraine?
I mean, I'm not a student of war, so I don't know about the theory about what wins them, but I just say that Western Europe's been ambivalent about how much of its resources it wants to put into supporting Ukraine, whereas Russia has not been at all ambivalent and has dedicated its entire sort of economy and really the whole country to fighting the war. So I'd say that probably accounts for more of the difference. And I'd just say on China, you know, that the response that would be most effective to people who are, I'd say there's concerns about committing yourself economically to a partner that doesn't have transparency in its government. And if you look at strengthening your democracy and having open competition and things like that, that's often the best way, if you consider there to be a threat from China, is to sort of return to what you said, to strengthen your democratic institutions, your competitive market, so that, you know, you become stronger rather than focusing on whatever you perceive to be the threat.
Thank you very much, Emma. Well, I think the only thing we can conclude is that Europe's future's still a work in progress. But I think I'm just going to indulge everyone with one sentence from a positive sentence from each of the three. Ivan, I know this is asking a lot of
It's difficult for me.
Rafał.
I'm an eternal optimist. I mean, at the end of the day, you can win with populists. I mean, Poland is a good case in point. Europe is still, along with Britain, the best place to live. And democracy is under attack, but it is still strong when people wake up and when they vote and when the young are mobilized. So we have a task at hand, but we can still win it.
Emma, final word?
I think that's a better final word.
I think we've reached a conclusion, but please, before we go, huge round of applause for Ivan Krastev, Rafał Trzaskowski, and Emma Graham Harrison.